Very shallow swimmer, and I don't do water so much.
Being in science, my life was spent
But I can't imagine. They say you're out there, you're not going to nail very well.
not real well. I knew who he was. I never had to use it. I think he was.
You will not believe it.
Yeah, I knew who it was. I was a medic.
They don't have.
Somebody like cell phone or something.
These guys, they needed that, they needed help.
Getting more slow.
The things that needed to happen to get life started here in Mercer County. Native Americans, of course, had been here for better than 10,000 years. If you go to Meadowcroft, anybody here ever been to Meadowcroft? Fantastic place. If you've ever been there, if you get a chance to go. There's a rock shelter there that people used for a good number of years, and it goes back to about 14,000 years ago from here. So, 12,000 years BC that we had people coming here. And I think that takes us right into the glacial age. The other thing that's interesting here is you'll have these Indians, they'll be hunter-gatherer fishermen at that time. They'll be coming to into Mercer County, this area, pretty quickly because they'll follow the moraine of the glacier. Now, if you know where Moraine State Park is, that's as far as it went south here during the last glaciation. And the Indians, if you look at up north, starts with a W, lost it. Wilhelm, yes. Lake Wilhelm, they started to do a swim beach and they came across ancient dwellings that were about 10,000 years old. So you have, in this area, 10,000 years of continual habitation. Again, the hunter-gatherers, fishermen came through. They enjoyed success here. The animals would be in this area because as the ice melted back, there would be water that they could live on. And truthfully, this area was probably much like a tundra at that time. The weight of the glacier would have pushed down our soil. The first things that probably would have occurred would have been pine trees. The pine trees would have started here, and then the deciduous trees would have moved up. The pine trees, of course, are a little more suited for colder weather. And we had here an area that was completely new. I mean, it had been scrubbed by a glacier, and mankind had basically come here. And I think that's something else we have to think about. We don't have a lot of evidence to that. The truth of the matter is, I was just hearing the other night that 400 feet of water has been added to the depth of our ocean over the course of since the last glaciation. So there was a period of time when Great Britain was attached to France. The islands would have been clumped together in better states, and Varangia, that northwest corridor, would have had a number of people that would have walked across, probably not knowing they were going to a different continent. But then the water came back. Probably ended up taking a lot of their areas where they settled, where they had camps, and pushing them either one way or the other. And we know that they were here. I mean, there were families that were split up after the Second World War, Eskimo families, Inuit, some in Siberia, some in the United States. So we know that's true. And then you ask yourself, what is a glaciation? A glaciation is a period of time when the temperature goes down and you can actually get a mile of ice upon the ground. Now that's, again, scraping. It'll scrape, it'll push the land down. Sandy Lake is a kettle lake that was formed out of the glaciation, as were the Great Lakes. So I think it's important we understand, these people are coming here while the ice is backing up. And as hunter-gatherers, they would follow herds, they would do whatever they had to do. Now a little later, what will happen is that they will settle down, they will start growing things, growing corn, beans, maize, the three sisters of the Iroquois Confederation. And you'll have a new sort of settlement starting to occur. And this is semi-sedentary areas where these hunter-gatherer fishermen would not be welcome. They'd all have to find their own land, their own way of living, their own way to do things differently. Now, we could talk a lot about the different cultures that were in this area. We could talk about the Monongahela culture. Monongahela culture is named after the river that it was over that the first remains were found. We know these people had religion. How do we know that? Their burials. You know, if you don't have a religion, you're more liable to leave the body just lay around. You know, and you're moving, it's gone, it's just there. But these folks would actually bury their dead. And you can tell a lot about their burials. You know, that's how we get information from these people, is in their junk piles, basically. And you know, we have this vision of these Indians killing mastodons, and they did, I'm not doubting that. But far more in their junk piles are squirrels and rabbits. You know, what are you going to do if you're a Native American? I'm going out for supper, I'm going to go chase down a mastodon. No, you're going to go out, you're going to say, this rabbit is kind of starting to annoy me, and I think we ought to take a shot at it. And you'll find, and again, probably, when you think about it, they probably moved their camp to where they made the kills and then came back to their normal camps. In their burials, they would always be facing east, the rising sun. You know, if you look at cemeteries today, Christian cemeteries, they're mostly facing east. Again, Christ is to come back riding on a cloud from the east. You know, there you are. Who wants to miss that show by looking the wrong direction? It's kind of interesting. In the Egyptian, at the Nile, facing east was the way that everything worked. On the east bank, you were closer to heaven. You start looking at the Egyptians. So it's not unusual to find that these folks had a religion. We don't know anything about it. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know much. We just know from their junk piles and from their burials what we could find out about their situation. Monongahela culture probably ended up in a warlike state. The reason we think this is their earlier villages were down beside the river, beside a place to get water, and their older ones were up on the top of hills. So if you're up on the top of a hill, they can't shoot down into there. And I think that's an interesting aspect, because they move themselves out of a comfort zone into an area where they'd have to haul their water, where they'd have to go out and hunt. And it seems like there were enemies to be had. Those enemies very easily could have been the mound builders. The mound builders, you've heard about them. Serpent Hill in Ohio. There's 10,000 of them in Ohio. There's undiscovered many wherever. And these folks seem to have come up came up the Mississippi, onto the Ohio, and on up into the Allegheny. They seem to live. I mean, we have mounds here they say in Mercer County. We had one in Greenville. right where the Canal Museum is today. And apparently during the last half of the 1800s, people tore that apart to see if they could find remains, you know, souvenirs basically. And I think it's important to understand that these people were looking for archaeological objects. That today we do it a lot different. We take it apart pretty piece by piece and scientifically. Back then people were just looking for remnants. And I think that's an important aspect about how we do things today as opposed to how we do things back then. Back then it was, okay, let's see what we can find. Today we start looking a little different. Now, the mound builders seem to have quit building mounds about 1560s, 1540s, 50s, and 60s. That's about the time that Hernando de Soto went through the southeastern part of the United States. Started in Florida, hit the Mississippi, you know, got out of there. Well, there seems to be, why did you quit building your mounds if they were your religion? And time after time after time, the things people thought about, the only thing that seemed to make sense was they became sick. They got, you know, why else would you quit your religion just that quickly? They may have got some of the European diseases because these folks then, at that point, the mound builders, 1560, they're starting to have these, what I tend to call wheels of trade and technology. You know, they have their own land, and maybe the Indians here went to Lake Erie during the salmon run, during the coho run, to get fish. You know, that was a big thing in the Northwest, and it was a thing here that people actually went to outside of their region or just in their region. And you had this whole area where you'd come into contact with other people. And it would normally be a pretty peaceful contact. And Indian fights back then aren't the way we thought they were. Normally it's all posture, and maybe a couple of people died, a couple of warriors, and somebody gave up land. The other person, okay, that's ours. So start over land. But they'd meet and they'd trade. For example, the Indians at Flint Ridge, Ohio, would trade with their neighbors. What do you have for? Well, we got this flint. There's only three kinds of minerals that will actually do you any good if you're trying to cut. You've got flint, you've got obsidian, and you've got chert. Those are the three kinds of minerals that will hold stones that will hold an edge. And I think that's important to understand. So at Flint Ridge, Ohio, you have these Indians who say, "Hey, we have this wonderful mineral. Why don't we trade these things?" And maybe they trade for, well, Osage orange runners, or suckers, or whatever you call them, that are growing out of the ground. And they're pretty straight. And you could make a bow, you could make a spear out of those pretty easily. So maybe those two people traded. Now once the people that had the suckers, but not the flint, once they had enough flint for themselves, they'd trade with another tribe who would give them something else. And that's slow. I mean, once everybody gets what they need, then they move on and trade it to somebody else. And I think that's an interesting thing. It's slow, but it is steady. So you have De Soto coming through the south of today the southern United States, and you have him giving up well, you have him in battle with the other Indians, and for a long period of time, it was thought that he was the disease factor. The Native Americans got the diseases off the Europeans, and then spread them in that webs of trade and technology kind of way, and they finally got up to the mound builders. But recent scientific thought, thinking, you know, how did these people, such a small disease vector, there's only 400 of them, and you know, however many Indians. How could that have happened more effectively? And the Native Americans and well, let's do it this way. The Europeans brought with them larder on the hoof. In other words, he arrived with 300 beef, 250, 300 pigs. And they'd actually have soldiers kind of rounding them up and following them wherever they went. It's thought that the pigs were the disease vector. Because what happens is pigs can get a lot of the diseases. They can transfer disease from their own self to humans. Yes, thank you. Mine's going a little bit slow here today. And what occurs is that if they lost just a couple breeding pigs, you know, couple male, couple female, they could have a number of hogs throughout the South. I mean, today we still have those boars that they hunt in the South. I don't think we have any around here right now, but I don't know that. And these boars will, when they're killed, or when something as simple as a mosquito bite, they can transfer their diseases to the Indians. And that way, those diseases can come up north. And it's thought that the mound builders caught these diseases. And then it became a question of, do we want to hunt and farm, or do we want to build these rock edifices for our religion? Well, it comes to the point where, say, 90% of your population dies, you can't even afford to ask the question, you just hunt. And maybe that's why the mound builders quit building their mounds in this area. And I've had people come up to me and say, I think I have a mound out behind my house. What am I going to do? Go out there and dig it up myself? I'd like to. However, you know, that needs scientific approach. Now, the next group of Indians that were in this area were the Erihana Indians, or the Erie tribe. They settled up around the Great Lakes, and they had their hunting grounds down into this area. They were, it is speculated that they were probably the 7th Iroquoian tribe. And at the time of the Beaver Wars, in the 1690s, 1680s, 90s, early 1700s, there's a romantic story about an Indian chief falling madly in love, an Iroquois Indian chief falling madly in love with the Erihana Indian chief, and there's an insult, and there's all of these things going on. But more likely what happened is the Seneca Indians wanted to use the Erihana land. And, you know, they are the newest of the prehistoric Indians we can talk about. Now, what is history? History is man's written knowledge of man. Prehistory is that before it is written down. Okay? So, in the 1687, I believe is the date, the Black Robes, they're the French Jesuits, I'm sorry, it took me a second. It was the French Jesuits came through this area and found some of the Erihana, the villages, deserted. Some of the dead in the villages, others of the dead in the battlefields of that war. So came that close to getting to know them as a people group, but they were wiped out as a tribe. What does that mean? Indian style, it means that some people died, warriors died, and then when they died, the rest of them were either ran away to the west along the Great Lakes and joined other tribes, or they were adopted into the tribes here. of the victors. And I think it's important to see that most of almost all the women and kids that didn't get away and run westward were adopted into the Seneca tribe. Now, the other thing, the men, some of them were tortured to death. And I won't talk about that too much. And some of them were adopted into the tribe. Again, your tribe's gone. What do you have to do? I think it's important to understand that once the tribe's dead, who can come back and restart it? I mean, you look at the Pilgrims, and they had help from a Native American. You probably saw this, Squanto. It was made, I think, by Disney, a movie, and it talked about Squanto. Well, he had been to Europe already. He knew English, you know. First Indian comes out of the bushes to talk to you. How you doing? What? You speak English? Yeah. And he had been captured, taken to Spain, traded to England, and found his way back. During that time, his tribe had got diseases. And they were gone. So what does he do? Him and another guy who went with him, you know, stayed there, and the Pilgrims came. And he helped them to understand agriculture. You know, the Pilgrims were town people, right? And they were urbanites in a rural setting. So it took somebody like Squanto to actually get this started for them. So you would take these tribes in this area, and they would be adopted into other tribes. And that left a big space here from the Alleghenies into Ohio, into the plains of Ohio, that the Iroquois used as a hunting grounds. Now, that didn't mean you couldn't pass through, but you did so at risk from the Iroquois. And if you were hunting there, you were supposed to, anything you killed, anything, you know, you got the fur off of it and gave it to the first Iroquois you found, because the fur was what was important. I mean, that's what the Beaver War started about, the issue of the little furry critter. And I think that's something that's kind of lost on us today. We don't see the roles that these animals played in their lives. How is it that we tell somebody what role these animals played? Well, perhaps it's in their use of terms. How many of you have ever heard of a Spanish doubloon? Some of us should have. You know, there's always that. It was a piece of 8. How many of you ever heard of pieces of 8? You know, the old pirates thing, that thing on the shoulder, pieces of 8, you know, that whole nonsense there. But what occurred was a Spanish doubloon was a piece of 8. I mean, that's what it was. It was part of a Spanish real, which is forget how much a pound, 1/8 of a pound of silver, its value. Okay, beaver was worth 1.5 Spanish doubloons. Okay? Do we use 1/8 in our money today? Anybody know the lyrics to that? Shave and a haircut, 2 bits. What's 2 bits?
Quarter.
What's 1 bit? 12.5 cents. They used to have 1-bit pieces. That, you know, 12.5 cent pieces. If any of you are, I was going to say that fancy name for a coin collector, but it's lost. Numisticist. If any of you, you'd know that about I think it was 1926. I don't know this as a fact. About 1926, they quit making 2-bit or 1-bit pieces, but they still made the 2-bit pieces, a quarter. Yeah. Right? So, you know, a Spanish doubloon. Doubloon doesn't flow off the tongue very well. So on our frontiers, this Spanish money was called a Spanish dollar. And I don't think we all know this, but until 1857, that money was good on the frontier. It was good throughout the United States. It wasn't demonetized until 1857. So, you know, here I got this old Spanish money and, you know, oh sure, I'll take it. But the thing is, the beaver was worth 1 1/2 pound, or 1 1/2 eighth of a real. Okay? A male white-tailed deer, was worth 1 Spanish doubloon, Spanish dollar. A doe was worth half a Spanish dollar. And we could talk about whether it was a red deer or a brown deer. And if you've watched deer, you know that in the spring and summer they get red. I mean, they lose all that excess fur. Over the, you know, the dogs lose their fur, your cats lose their fur, deer lose their fur. And then in the fall, they grow it back, and it gets dark and brown. They're harder to see. Now, one has more value than the other. Don't need to talk about that. It's one of the things tomorrow I'll be on Ron Verb show. You know, WPIC, 5 o'clock. And I always tell him, I said, history is not simple. Because it's more complex than people really, you know, they want to think it was one way. But it really wasn't. Now, you take that 1 Spanish dollar for a male white-tailed deer. Is there another word for a male white-tailed deer? Buck. 1 Spanish dollar was equal to 1 buck.
Oh.
We still use the terminology they used in the mid-1750s to talk about our money. Have any of you ever heard of dough?
Oh,
It was worth 50 cents. It just blows my mind that I don't know where people thought we got this buck thing. I don't know where people thought we got this dough thing, but we got it. We got it. And it came from the 1750s. And I think it's important that we understand that when we start talking about what the Indians are doing here. They're growing, well, they harvested most of the beaver here. And again, it was sent back to Europe. And the Indians didn't know the value of the beaver skin in Europe, so how can you make a good deal? I mean, you can't. And what they do is they take the outside layer of skin off, you get that inside layer, the soft and fuzzy, nice stuff, and you'd make it into felt. And once it was made into felt, you could make it into gloves or hats or coats, and you would have this wonderful beaver skin accoutrements. And the beaver was harvested for the vanity of Europe, for the upper class of Europe. The lower class got the buckskin. And the buckskin's kind of an interesting thing because you have to harvest it and you have to tan it. Buckskin was never made into leather. It just was never, that wasn't the way it was. It was tanned. Leather is a chemical process, Middle Eastern and European in origination, but it was tanned here in the New World. And you would take this fur and you'd put it on it'd be a frame, basically, a round frame, and you'd put the deer skin over it, and you'd bind it, and you would hang it to dry. In the winter, and I read this in Sir William Johnson's papers. If you ever get a chance and you're interested in Native Americans from about that era, Sir William Johnson's papers are excellent. They're free online, so you can get them. And I read that one group of Indians actually put them inside their wickiups. And they'd have the fire burning to keep warm, make food, all the things up. And they would have these lining the outside for insulation. And it's interesting to me because it would become tan. You read into the Pennsylvania archives and you start getting this idea of the used clothing. The used clothing was used was worth more. Because some of the more unscrupulous traders would get the Indians drunk. And when the Indians woke up the next morning, they'd be butt naked. Because they took the clothing off their backs because it was worth more money. It's just, those things are interesting. The area we live in started out as, well, I've given you the Monongahela culture, the mound builders, now the Erie Hana, and now we're with the Iroquoian Indians, the Seneca primarily. And it became a hunting preserve for them. So out of that one sentence where I said, you take the animal skin and give it to an Iroquoian, we've got money, we've got everything else going on. So what they do is they use this as an area to hunt. And they would use it as an area to hunt to be able to get their guns, be able to get their burial materials. Wampum. Talk about wampum all day. It's an interesting topic, but it's interesting. When the Europeans first started trading with the Indians, the wampum is that thick part in a bivalve. Two different ones. One that has a white thickness and then a blue thickness. It's called white and black wampum, and you can make different strings or belts of it, and it's just an interesting thing because it has spiritual value and it has monetary value. And I think it's important to understand that when the Europeans first started coming here, they learned about the wampum pretty quick. But they didn't know anything about the Europeans. And the Europeans started bringing these multicolored beads from Europe over. And they would trade them as they were wampum. And they'd get good prices. The Europeans were taking them to town on this stuff. And knives and everything else. And what occurs then is we find that prior to European settlement, there's a few things of wampum buried with the Native Americans. Okay? Their guns are buried with the Native Americans. A lot of their clothing is buried with the Native Americans. If you were an heir to somebody who passed away amongst the Native Americans at that time, you'd get small things. The inheritance wasn't there. You wouldn't get the gun. It would be buried with you. And that, of course, led to more dependency amongst the Indians. You'd have to get your own gun, even if Dad's was a perfectly good gun, you buried with him. And you'd have to buy the gun. You'd have to get more wampum. So you have these few pieces of wampum in the burials. Then suddenly you have all these European beads, and you literally have thousands of these beads in a burial. After about 2 or 3 generations, you finally go back to 1 or 2 pieces of wampum and some. But for a while, the Europeans had this great idea of what, they had a great market, let's put it that way. That's probably the easiest way to say it. And with that market, they got a better price out of their material than they probably were worth. Now, until 1722, after 1680, 1690, the Erie Hana were destroyed. Until 1722, nobody lived here in this area at all. After the walking purchase in Pennsylvania history, if you're not familiar with that, again, here we go. The walking purchase was this idea that the Native Americans had agreed that on a certain date they would give enough land that a man could walk in one day. And they'd give that to the Europeans. And this is in Delaware. They're the ones that signed the original with William Penn, and it's going on. And what happened was that there were newspaper ads put out looking for fast men, basically. And what occurred is they found 3 men who would run together as a team. And they had people out clearing a path for them. And the Indians, what they would intend a person to do would be get up, clean up camp, go out walking for 4 or 5 hours, set up a new camp, go out hunting. So maybe 2 or 3 hour walk is what they were planning. Well, the Europeans, being masters of legalese, I don't know, they would start running at midnight, and they would run till the following midnight. And one guy had a heart attack, died. Another guy, I just quit after about 12 hours of running. The third guy ended up getting, I think it was about 90 miles. So instead of, 15, 90 or more. And the Indians basically, the Delaware Indians said, hey, you guys cheated us. And they took it to they were underneath the Iroquois. The Iroquois were their father or their uncles or whatever. And the Iroquois said, nah, just be quiet, you made the deal, live with it. And about half of them, the Western, the Wolf clan, moved into the Allegheny Valley, that area from Pittsburgh to Johnstown to Katanning. That's the triangle where it started. And they started living there without Iroquois permission. They just said, we're not going to deal with these Europeans. That doesn't mean they didn't trade with them. They were just trying to remove themselves from in front of them. I mean, they came over the hill, over the mountains, basically with horses, pigs, chickens. They lived, some of them in log cabins, some of them in longhouses, some of them in individual wickiups for families. And they came here and they settled. And as the Europeans headed further and further west, more and more Indians and Indian tribes joined with them. And, so you have those folks coming out here without permission and living here. The Iroquois said, now wait a minute, we can't have this. So what we will do is we will send half-kings amongst them who will rule for us. And one of the things about Indian nomenclature, when they take a name, if they were a warrior, they'd take like colonel, captain, they take a military title. And if they were just politicians, they would take half-king. Because that's half as important as a king, that whole idea there. So they sent Iroquoians here to live amongst the Delaware and manage their affairs. It's hard to say what the Delaware thought of that whole thing, but that's how they adjusted it. We could talk about the 7 Years' War. I don't know how far you want to go. Do we still have time?
How are we doing? We're getting close to time. How are we doing, folks? Is it about it?
Yeah.
No? Yes?
Okay, well, I can certainly come back and talk some more.
Well, we could do that. How about moving into a little local history now, local Indians,
Okay,
for 10 or 15 more minutes,
Sure.
okay?
sure. The local Indians here were, well, it's been easy to start, not really. But what happened is that most of the Delaware, after the Battle of Katanning, moved out to the Miami River to be safe. And of course, this was something that there's a vacuum, people move in. So you had some of the Shawnee, some of the Wyandot, but most importantly you had a lot of the Seneca Indians moving in here. The Indians that were here after the American Revolution tended to be Seneca, known as Mingos, because they were unlanded Seneca. They didn't have land up north. They came here, they became known as Mingos. Now, the Indians that happened to be here after the American Revolution, you had, during the American Revolution, you had the Sullivan and Broadhead expeditions that burned out a lot of Indian camps, that took the Indians out of the American Revolution. So what happened almost immediately after the the American Revolution, they sent guys out here to survey, you know, get some land plots made up, and we're going to send people out. Well, what happened was that some of the Indians didn't like that too much, and you had some bloodshed about that. And it wouldn't be until after Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad Anthony Wayne stopped the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers out by Toledo. That you would have some peace here where people could move in. Valentine Cunningham, I think it was about 1799, 1798. Does anybody happen to remember? 98, 1798, moved into this area. There were small Indian camps here. There would be a couple of families, they'd be hunting camps, and the Indians would travel back and forth amongst the population. By 1800, there were 3,200 people, 3,228, I believe, people living in Mercer County. And Mercer County, of course, stretched down to the northern boundary of Newcastle today. So again, just another little piece of the pie there. And the Indians would help the Europeans. And every European that was here at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, would have stories about Indians. Now, there were two kinds of people. Those that liked the Indians, they were pretty good to them, and those that didn't like the Indians, who were not good at them. Now, the Indians would stay around and help the Europeans plant, build houses, build barns, do whatever. But they would tend to drink a lot. Okay? And what would occur is when you have somebody imbibing a little too much, you would have a variety of things that would occur. One gentleman wrote of finding, well, this one Indian man and woman came into his house at the early evening one night. And they were, there was some libations, and they'd come here pretty much drunk anyhow. And during the night they argued, so they got kicked out. Next morning they found the Indian squaw dead on their doorstep. And this Indian, his name was Jacob. His European name was nowhere to be found. Well, it went out to Chief Flynn that there had been a murder. Chief Flynn came, collected the body. Here it was his sister. So the Native Americans of that time were great for getting people into the ground as quickly as possible. I mean, call it Jewish or Muslim, or one of those cultures that buried people the day, if they could, the day of the death. And he took some poached corn, and he started off after this brother-in-law of his. And Chief Flynn, it's the middle of winter, it's snowing, Chief Flynn eventually caught up to him because there were only so many Indian paths that went through the area. And if an Indian was trying to get to another place, he would take this or that path. And he caught up to him in Ashtabula. His brother, I guess it's his former brother-in-law, knelt before him. The Indian raised his gun and fired, killed him. He turned around and came back home. He was only gone 2 days. 2 days. Get from Mercer County to Ashtabula on feet, on foot, in the winter, and come back. He was only gone 2 days. Now, you folks know of the Pews, right? I'm sure you do. I was here in Grove City. Now, Mr. Pugh, the father of the young family, and his wife lived in Mercer. Now, they lived about where Theophilus MacDonald built his house. I could take you there and show it, because there's a spring there. And what he did was that there were several things that occurred at his house. One was that a Native American came into his house, and Samuel Pugh, who laid out the town of Mercer, he had helped lay out the town of Mercer. He was 8 years old, and the guy says to him, "Now, Sam, you hold the stake right there, I'll drive it in. When you get to be an old man, you can tell him that you helped lay out Mercer." And so he did, by the way. That's how we know that. It's in the 1888 history. And what occurred was that these Indians came in to the Pugh house, and Samuel was sitting in the fireplace. And I say that intentionally because the fireplaces were very big at that time, because you had to go in and cook in the fireplace. And they had a big log, and he was sitting there playing with the embers, or whatever kids do. You know, they'll be annoying whatever they do. Now, if you have 8-year-olds, you know that. Now, what this Indian, Harthagig, maybe you've heard the name, Harthagig Hunting and Fishing Club, Harthagig Gun Club, Harthagig Post Office. There was a number of Harthagigs, things that were named after him. And this Indian mate who was drunk grabbed the Indian by the hair, or grabbed Sam Pugh by the hair and said, "I will scalp you." And he had his knife out, and the two Indian friends that came in with him, and a third guy, James Jeffers, bum rushed him out of the house. Next morning, Sam was outside kicking around in the snow like kids will do, and James Jeffers comes by and says, "Have you seen Harthagig today?" "Yeah, he went that way, and a couple hours ago." And James Jeffers head out that way. Well, nobody ever saw Harthagig again. About a dozen years later, there was a large body found in the insides of an old sycamore tree. And everybody always thought that maybe, just maybe, that was the body of Harthagig, because he was gone. And Jeffers went after him. Jeffers, by the way, had lost all of his family in the years prior to this, during the 7 Years' War. And that's the dividing point, really. Prior to the 7 Years' War, the Indians were given a noble continence in everything. And after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as it was called in America, the Indians were always looked down upon. Even the half that sided with us, they were all looked down upon. And by the end of the American Revolution, they were dressed as drunks in the artwork that you saw of them. Now, what's interesting is that it wasn't until James Fenimore Cooper started writing his Leatherstockings tale that you got the other side of the story taken back into context. I know we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give you a little chance to ask a few questions. Yes, sir.
Cecil Harper from Grove City used
Yes.
to do a lot of arrowhead collecting.
Yes.
Seemed to find, in talking with him, he found an awful lot on the Pugh Flats.
Yes.
The Pugh Farms.
Yes.
He also found an awful lot right just outside of Grove City here on the Franklin Richardson property.
Okay.
And he would be out there 3 or 4 times every year walking the fields to check for arrowheads. If there was any plowing done in a rain, he was usually there the next day. Why is it that we have, and they tell you that Slippery Rock had an Indian village, they talk about Newcastle having an Indian village, but we never hear anything about the Grove City area having an Indian village, and yet there are so many arrowheads being found, that have been found in this area. Can you explain that? What, they surely just weren't dropped hunting.
No.
I can't believe that.
I'd love to. If I could ever find, let's just do it this way. Part of my lecture series at Penn State, I teach this class every year. Something that looks like a tree. I'm going to draw it for you. You know, it comes down like that, and across like that, and then down and out and in. That's what we normally call an arrowhead, right?
Yeah.
That's not an arrowhead. That's a projectile point.
Okay.
Projectile point is a fancy name for a spear that's meant to be thrown. And what occurs is that Indians, how much is an arrowhead worth? You know, this is one of the things I talk to my fourth graders about when they come around and look at our arrowheads. How much is an arrowhead worth? Well, it's worth the price of the product. But how long would it take you to make an arrowhead? Me, 6, 8 months. You know, and it would be dull. I guarantee it. But if you, how many of you ever heard of Dutch Wiley? Anybody? Lee has. Dutch Wiley was a guy, and I don't know if he's still around or not, in Pardo. And he was a flint knapper.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
And it takes about 3 minutes to make an arrowhead once you have a blank. Okay, and we're still finding these blanks in different places around where Indians had buried them, meant to come back, get them, obviously didn't get there. But what happens, it takes about 3 minutes. So the value of these projectile points is limited. Okay, it's 3 minutes work plus whatever it took to make it. And it wasn't until about 500 years before Columbus got here, you know, about 1000 AD, that the Indians developed bows and arrows. The evolution of weaponry started with, you know, here I'm going to jab a critter with a spear. Then I'll throw it at a critter. And then they developed what's known as the atlatl. ATL, ATL. And that's the throwing stick. And what it does is it lays across your arm, and you hold it in there, and you hold this spear point, and you throw it. And it doubles about how far you can throw it. So what would happen is these low value items. Now admittedly, if you could find it after you'd used it, you'd use it again. But that's, you know, still low value. And once you throw it, and you lost it, oh well. You know, so you had, for 10,000 years, well, almost 11,000 years, you had Indians in Mercer County throwing these atlatls, these spears with the atlatl, and they lost a good number of them. I don't know if, you know, I couldn't give you any idea of how many. And what occurs is that a real arrowhead looks just kind of triangular, and it would be tied on the end of a stick. And I think it's important to understand that when you tie these items onto the end of a stick, you know, again, if you're using trade items, the metal ones, they go away. They dissolve into the soil. So there are probably thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of projectile points in the area. And oftentimes you'll find an arrowhead and say, that can't be an arrowhead because it doesn't look like it. So you say, this is the tip of an arrowhead or something. So,
what about the spear points? Now, they're elongated and they're about 4 to 6 inches in length.
yes.
You're telling me that where does that fit in according to your?
Well, there were always spears. They were used for different things.
Yeah.
Everything from, you know, protecting yourself you know, say for example, you were in your house and some animal decided it wanted to run through. You'd use your spear or your stone knife to do that. Okay, does that make sense? Or?
Well, yeah, I was just, you know, we were talking about the spearhead was one that had the notches on the back. And
Yes.
the spear, but these, the elongated ones don't have that.
Yes.
Very seldom.
But see, that's a different era of projectile points during the atlatl period. And it can be a spear, truly. It can be, because what is an arrow but a shortened spear? And it just, you know, you have what you have.
Now, the real small ones, I've heard 2 or 3 different ones. Real small and white were ceremonial or for bird shot.
Yeah. Now the real small ones, oftentimes I've seen those made into, believe it or not, fishing hooks.
Yeah, I have to.
Yeah, that are kind of interesting. Yeah, they could be ceremonial, but chances are they were probably bird shot. And you know, you have the Flint Hill in Ohio, not Flint Hill, Flint Ridge in Ohio, and it's basically a Mercer chert. It's a flint that's sent out. Now, some places you get the white, and I couldn't tell you the nearest one, but it went out the same way, and it would be used by Indians for ceremonial, but also for real. You know, Indians were pragmatists. They needed to live. They needed to get food. And I hate to say that, but that's what they needed. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Can I ask something?
Sure.
You talk about the mound builders.
Yeah.